It appears that the legacy of the Cold War is still being felt today, with many people, um, even within influential positions, still seem to view modern day Russia as almost still being like the Soviet Union. They seem to still have the Cold War mentality on their mind. Uh, Given your background in Cold War history, what can you tell us about the original Cold War compared to the modern day relationship of US and Russia?
That's in many ways it's a tough question. I think to some extent we have re-entered a Cold War climate, like it or not. It's
Maybe hot war.
the risk is always there. There's always a risk of escalation, and then accidental mistakes leading to further escalation. But look, it's the problem, I guess. Russia, I don't think it's, I mean, from where I stand as a European, momentarily transplanted in Australia, living in Australia, um, the problem with Russia is, of course, the end of the Cold War was a boon, not simply because the Soviet Union was no longer there and therefore no longer posed an ideological threat to the rest of Europe, and also, of course, everyone perhaps somewhat cynically hoped that Russia would be a much diminished power, and of course, Russia is always, in a sense, has been, how to describe it, the elephant in the China shop, because it's such a big country which spans from Europe to Asia. It's really a Eurasian country, and then of course it borders on. It's also part of Europe, and so. And when you look at Europe from a geopolitical point of view, you have this huge power on the border, well, just bordering with Eastern Europe, and therefore there's always going to be a certain degree of suspicion in what Russia may or may not do. And so I think the end of the Cold War was a boon, because the hope was that Russia would um, engage more closely with the West. By engaging more closely with the rest of Europe, in a sense, Russia would be a stakeholder in European stability rather than a spoiler. That, of course, was that's where Russia was heading to, really up until the 2004, 2005. Then, of course, there was a significant change in Russian foreign policy, which is from engaging with Europe actually to withdrawing from this engagement, and then openly confronting the West on a number of issues. And so I don't think, to be honest, that we fear resurgence of the Soviet Union. I mean, I wouldn't say that Putin, as well, his regime, or does not espouse any ideology, or doesn't really rely, sometimes its political discourse sometimes is quite ideological. But of course, Russia of today doesn't really represent, by any stretch of imagination, the same ideological threat that the Soviet Union presented during the Cold War. So I don't think no one sees Russia as, if you like, a Soviet Union undercover, or a Soviet Union in the making. Call it as you like, but nonetheless, the shock has been tremendous over the past 12 months, because you've seen the return to a fully fledged war in Europe, and the kind of rhetoric coming out of Moscow is scaring the hell out of many leaderships. And so, of course, the question remains to what extent whether Russia has had any reason to do what it did. In my view, of course, did not have any reason. You don't invade another country. And more to the point, the idea that NATO was a threat to Russia. To me, I have Russian friends. I talk to them. But I tell them, as I would tell you, it's simply laughable in the sense that for anyone familiar with the rest of Europe, traveling, working, having spent months or years in Europe, you realize what little appetite exists in Europe for war and for a return to the past. I mean, if you look at key European countries over the past 30 years, they haven't uh, they haven't really strengthened their military capabilities. In fact, they've cut back and failed to modernize in certain areas, to the point that nowadays, at the moment, one of the problems that the Europeans are facing and NATO is facing is that we might not be able to provide Ukraine with munitions and weapon system for too long if the war persists for 1 or 2 years. We're also running low on certain stocks of munitions and weapon system. And so to tell you that over the years, NATO countries have not invested in their military capabilities. And for Russia to say that actually NATO really presented a challenge, it's also, I think, laughable because it's not that, I mean, you could argue that NATO has expanded to East, and in a sense it has expanded, but what expanding means in reality? If it means that a number of former Soviet satellites, as well as former Soviet republics, decided to seek membership of NATO to ensure themselves against the resurgence of Russia, is that really NATO posing a threat to Russia? I think it's very much a self-defensive measure by some. But of course, I also understand that Russia sees it as an infringement on its near abroad, or what they call limitrova, the borderlands, or what was part of the former Soviet or Tsarist empire. And is that a reasonable view to have? I think if you were a sort of 19th century, early 20th century policymaker, the idea of sphere of influence is perfectly acceptable. And I don't have any problem in accepting that perhaps you should take into account certain Russian sensibilities. But on the other hand, to say that, as the Russians saying, are arguing that, well, it's NATO waging a war against them, they reacted because to some extent NATO was trying to push Ukraine into its midst. Well, I think it's just it's rather would have been Ukraine under the new leadership wanting to join the European Union and NATO, and if they'd done so, of course, probably they would not have been invaded by Russia. But to cut a long story short, I think the current leadership in Moscow, it's doing its best to send the wrong message, and in a sense instilling the fears that actually the current Russia could be an unfriendly power, as the Soviet Union was just during the Cold War.
Um, Interesting. I would, push back a little bit on that one. With I can understand. I mean, with Russia, I can understand the historical fear of being invaded, and they're still being haunted by World War II. So they've learned that lesson. So they're very um, particular about any encroaching forces near their borders. They learned that very much the hard way. I think they also saw the way the US has been, I suppose, treating other countries like Iraq, Iran, Libya, and this anti-Russian rhetoric within America, going back. I think it really ramped up around 2008, 2007. It started to get more focused on Russia. Also, more recently, it came out the idea of Merkel. I think she admitted that she signed with the Minsk agreement. I can't remember now, but basically she admitted going, "Yeah, we signed the documents, but we were just buying time. We didn't really mean it." I mean, there's that, and also the idea of even recently the Nord Stream pipeline. Apparently, it's now been there's much more, I suppose, evidence coming out that it's more the US blowing it up. So when you're confronted with all these other aspects going on, um, also geopolitically, I think the unipolar moment of the US dominance is now coming to an end, and we're seeing more of a multipolar world coming up again. Not just with Russia, but also,
With
India,
China.
China, Brazil, and everything else. I think the US is more acting like the typical behavior of a power trying to cling on to its dominance. Um, I think Russia, when it comes to its landmass and its resources and everything else, is a second America in that way. So they're one of the few countries that can offer some pushback, unlike the smaller countries that I mentioned, before.